Very few people have ever seen this. It's fabulous. It's like Christmas morning, this. This is just extraordinary. Just look for yourselves. Just look. Look at their faces. Look at their eyes.
Surrounded by these pyramids, the images of Amun and Mut and their monumental temples, it's easy to forget that the Kushites were actually a foreign power who'd taken Egypt by force. Throughout the first millennium BC, Egypt faced wave after wave of foreign invaders. But in the face of such a strong and long-lived culture, all who would try to take over Egypt would themselves be taken over. Almost 1,000 years before Cleopatra, Egypt had entered its third intermediate period, a time of political decline and vulnerability.
For it's the beginning of the 22nd dynasty, around 945 BC. The priests are in charge of the south, but in the north, the vultures have started to circle, waiting for their chance to swoop, as a group of Libyan generals seize power to rule as pharaohs of a divided land.
In many ways, Egypt's waning power had been triggered by a loss of faith. When the authority of the New Kingdom pharaohs had begun to crumble, Egypt's once pious priests had helped loot the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, systematically dismantling Egypt's previously unshakable belief in the afterlife. With the decline in power of the New Kingdom pharaohs, the Libyans, who'd fought for the Egyptians as mercenary generals, gradually infiltrated Egypt's power structure and eventually took power as the 22nd dynasty. Egypt's Libyan rulers understood that looking and acting Egyptian would help to keep the country under their control. These beautiful bracelets are just a tiny fraction of the golden treasures created for Egypt's Libyan royals, who on the surface at least upheld many of Egypt's most sacred traditions. In many ways, Libyan rule was destined to fail, because even if they were militarily superior, their adoption of Egyptian culture was at best superficial and was insufficient to unite the country. In the north, the squabbling Libyan elite fought amongst themselves, while in the south, the Egyptian priesthood, including yet more Libyan princes, still clung to power. A fragmented Egypt was easy pickings for any would-be invader. Egypt needed a regime that could reconnect with its most powerful asset, its history. And by 747 BC, that's what happened, when the Kushite rulers of Nubia made a direct spiritual connection with Egypt's glorious past.
Now, the Kushites were Egypt's southern neighbours in Nubia, and from time immemorial, they and the Egyptians had kind of battled around the sort of southern border of Egypt. By the 8th century BC, however, the Kushites had the upper hand.
They were fervent believers in Egypt's traditional gods, in some ways making them more Egyptian than the Egyptians. The kingdom of Kush in Nubia was at the very edge of the Egyptian world. Having been repeatedly conquered by Egypt, the Kushites had been hugely influenced by Egyptian beliefs. Beliefs that centred on this great sandstone mountain, Jebel Barkal. For centuries, it had been regarded as the mythical mound of creation. The mound from which Egypt's great creator god, Amun, was born.
Here is the holy mountain. This is where the god lived in his primeval form.
Dr. Tim Kendall has spent almost 30 years working at the site.
Being at the southern limit of the empire, it was where the Nile began, where fertility began, and so it had to be the place where creation began. So this was they imagined this as the birthplace of the god Amun. And so this was the primeval Karnak.
When the New Kingdom pharaohs had arrived here in 1500 BC, they built this temple and dedicated it to Amun and his wife, the goddess Mut. And when the Egyptians withdrew from Nubia some 400 years later, the native Kushites continued to honour the sacred mountain and Egypt's spiritual traditions. As the Kushite kings gained increasing military power, they also claimed Egypt for themselves. So when King Pi led a Kushite invasion of Egypt in 747 BC, he didn't plunder or destroy, but restored and rebuilt, and founded Egypt's 25th dynasty.
The irony is that he's conquering Egypt to put everything right, I suppose.
So it's all such a cycle of rebirth, regrowth, redevelopment, and the Kushite kings are really kind of tapping into that ancient power source and just sort of giving it back to the Egyptians.
It's like starting time all over again and doing it right.
So they had that same sense of history and continuity as the Egyptians. They are the natural successors of the 18th dynasty kings.
Fueled by a genuine desire to make their own mark in Egypt's long story, the Kushites began to rebuild Egypt here in their Nubian heartland. King Pi expanded the existing temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal to balance the original great temple of Karnak in Egyptian Thebes. But while the Kushites had absorbed the culture of Egypt, they still had their roots here in Africa. This cultural fusion is quite clearly expressed in this extraordinary representation of the Egyptian goddess Mut.
The face of the goddess Mut has tribal scars, and look, we'll see if it shows with this light. You see the 3 lines of her face?
So this is an Egyptian goddess with a Nubian makeover?
Yeah, she was a goddess of Nubia, and it was appropriate for Nubians to have tribal scars.
So this is a very, very graphic version of the way in which local Nubians were making the traditional deities of Egypt their own, physically marking them. It's as if she's been stamped as a Nubian.
Yep.
This is such a land of surprises. That is beautiful. Never been here before. I have no idea what's going on in here, so this will be as new to me as it is to you. Oh, flipping heck.
It's a real privilege to see the time-blackened walls finally giving up their secrets.
Wow, look at that, look at that. Oh, that is so beautiful. They're bringing out not just the golds, but the blues, these 2 colours, the bright blue of the sky and the Nile, and the gold, this sort of really powerful colour of the sun god.
This is Taharqa, the Kushite's most powerful and important pharaoh. In classic Egyptian style, he's shown offering to the god Amun and his wife, the goddess Mut.
It's fabulous. It's like Christmas morning, this. This is just extraordinary. Just look for yourselves. Just look. Look at their faces. Look at their eyes.
This wall truly exemplifies Egypt's ancient magic, as those who try to conquer it end up being seduced by it and then become a part of it. And outside on the mountain, he exhibits his devotion on a truly monumental scale by embellishing the very top of its pinnacle. 180 metres tall and 11 metres from the cliff face, it seems completely inaccessible. But Taharqa pulled off an incredible technical achievement. He built a crane arm and elaborate scaffolding in order to make his own permanent mark on the mountain.
What he did was he made an inscription for himself commemorating his victories east and west, and then underneath his men set a small statue of the king, and they covered the inscription with gold. Today you can hardly see it, but in those days it would have been the most conspicuous feature of the mountain.
I mean, that's meant to be seen by the gods.
Seen by the gods.
Of course, no mortal eye could read this from the ground, but that wasn't the point. This was a message to the gods carved on a monument built to impress. Completely covered in gold, it reflected the sun's rays, and it acted like a giant billboard as it telegraphed Taharqa's message for miles around. And this again harked back to Egypt's past, when previous pharaohs had placed gilded capstones on their pyramids and obelisks to harness the potent powers of the sun. Just to the east of Jebel Barkal lies the necropolis of Nuri, where the Kushite king's transformation into Egyptian pharaohs was finally completed. For the dynasty who'd invaded Egypt were now copying Egypt's ultimate symbol. And for the first time in over 1,000 years, the kings who ruled Egypt were buried in pyramids.
When the kings made their capital at Memphis, they were living right across the river from the Great Pyramids. Taharqa spent most of his life there and was familiar with the Great Pyramids. And so when he died, he needed a pyramid of commensurate scale. And this, he sort of established this new type, and it was followed by all of his successors.
The Kushites eventually built more pyramids here in their Nubian homeland than the Egyptians had built in Egypt. And just as at Giza, Taharqa's pyramid is precisely aligned to its environment. Surrounded by these pyramids, the images of Amun and Mut and their monumental temples, it's easy to forget that the Kushites were actually a foreign power who'd taken Egypt by force. Yet it's almost as if Egypt was taunting its invaders. While you may try and dominate our land, our culture will ultimately dominate you. And as such, the Kushites left a legacy of renewal and resurrection.